All right, y'all. So today we are going to be talking about keeping respect for yourself, or otherwise self respect effectiveness skills, known as the FAST skills. And all of this information, or a good chunk of it at least, can be found on Interpersonal Effectiveness Handout number 7 in your binder. So feel free to pull that out if you want to follow along. So far we've talked about objectives effectiveness and relationship effectiveness. So what we're going to be focusing on today is the last of these three core interpersonal effectiveness skills. And just as a reminder, objectives effectiveness, or the Dear Man skill, is really about getting what you want from others, where the relationship effectiveness skill, or the Give skill that we talked about last week, is about keeping and improving the relationships that you have. And this final set of skills, self-respect effectiveness, is about keeping and improving your self-respect in interpersonal interactions and conversations. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the rest of today's video. But before we go there, it's sometimes helpful to see these three together first, because all of these, of course, as we noted in the beginning of this module, work together. And in some cases, self-respect effectiveness might be the priority of a conversation or interaction that you're having. And in all cases, we want self-respect effectiveness to at least be in the picture, so that we can be effective in interpersonal conversations. So what is the FAST skill? First, be fair, no apologies, stick to values, and be truthful. And here we're really focusing on core skills for how to go about getting what you want, or saying no, without losing respect for yourself in the process of doing so. So the key question here really is, how do you want to feel about yourself after having the interaction, say a conversation with your partners, or a difficult parenting moment with your kiddos? And we all have experiences, times where we lost respect for ourselves in the process of a conversation or an interaction. A common example for me is often situations in which I really wanted to say no. I did not have the time to do something, or it was actually against my values to do something for someone else. And I said yes anyway to really preserve the relationship, and lost respect for myself in the process. And other examples include, like, sometimes we can lose respect for ourselves when we lash out and get angry at a partner, or our kids, or a boss at work. We can feel a sense of less respect for ourselves when we cry or get very emotional in situations where it interfered with our ability to feel effective. And so there are a lot of different ways that this can show up for us, that we can leave interactions feeling like our self-respect actually went down as a result of how they went. So our goal here is to practice a set of skills that are going to increase our sense of self-respect, or help to maintain it, when we are in interpersonal interactions. And that might be when the goal is to maintain self-respect, or it may be the case that the goal is to get an objective met, or your main goal is to work on a relationship. And even then, keeping these skills in your pocket, practicing them and using them, can be so helpful, both in increasing your overall effectiveness, and in helping you to meet that goal ultimately. And it's important to note that self-respect is not something that we're born with, right? These are skills that take practice to develop a sense of mastery or effectiveness in and of themselves. And we might even have beliefs about our self-worth, about the perceived burdensomeness of asking for what we want, that can get in the way or make it particularly difficult to practice these skills, or to develop them to begin with. And so the good news is that this skill, like any other that we practice, is a muscle. And through practice and application, which we're going to do more of when we meet next week, we can start to flex this muscle and strengthen it, so it becomes easier and easier to use, even in difficult context. And a final note here on this slide is that our goal is effectiveness, right? So we want to balance the FAST skills with the other interpersonal effectiveness skills, depending on our goals and the context. And in this way, it can be helpful to go back to those mindfulness what and how skills. Observe and describe, and non-judgmentally in particular, come to mind, because they can be really helpful in starting to observe our own tendencies. So whether or not we have a tendency to kind of ignore the FAST skill altogether, to leave self-respect out of the picture and really only focus on our relationships or our objectives, or whether we tend to over-rely on the self-respect part of the picture at the cost of some of the other interpersonal effectiveness skills. And as you're working through those observations, it can be helpful to note that it might depend on context, right? We tend to have different patterns and ways of being sometimes with our kids that are different than partners, than bosses. So you might have certain tendencies in particular relationships worth noting to find the middle path that's going to make you feel most effective and ultimately be most effective in those contexts. So let's break this down a little bit together. Be fair. This means be fair to yourself and the other person involved or other persons, and validate your own feelings and wishes as well as theirs. And this comes back to the mindfulness, observing non judgmentally and describing for yourself what your tendencies in this area tend to be. So, is it the case that it's really difficult to validate for yourself what you're feeling or that the request that you're asking for is reasonable? Or is it particularly challenging, say, with kiddos and littles, like we talked about last week, to validate their feelings? And the goal here, the idea is that to best maintain our sense of self respect, we really need to be doing both validating what it is that we're feeling and what the other person might be feeling. Next step, no apologies. And this means not over apologizing or looking ashamed when it doesn't fit the facts of the situation, and not invalidating the valid. And we spoke a little bit about this last point during our last meeting, but not invalidating the valid can be a confusing, I think, phrase to hold in mind. And so an example of this would be saying something like, I'm so sorry to have to ask you for this. And I know it's silly for me to want this. And you can hear some of that kind of observe the judgmental language out there of like saying it's silly to want something or it's not reasonable to ask. And we kind of undermine our own self respect when we invalidate our own thoughts and feelings while making a request or apologize for something when a transgression hasn't been made, when there's not something that we've done that really merits an apology. So an example here might be thinking like, what is a context in which I tend to apologize and it might not be called for? So, for example, saying, I'm so sorry before any time you make a request. This is a pattern I myself have had to work on breaking, not saying, I'm so sorry to have to ask you this, but would you be able to pick me up later today? And instead saying, it would be really helpful to me if you could pick me up later if it would that work for you? Is that possible? The third fast skill here is stick to values, and that means stick to your own personal values, your beliefs, and your sense of integrity, and to not sell out those values unless it is absolutely necessary and very important. So, when it's not necessary to disregard your own valid values and what you believe is morally right, um, to stick with that, to stick to your guns, and to be clear about what you value. Um, and this might mean really often just explicitly stating to the other person, say, I really value your honesty and willingness to have a conversation with me about this. Um, Say in that context, letting it be known specifically what is the value that you're holding and articulating that so the other person can better understand where you're coming from and you can be more in touch with those values while you're going about that conversation. And finally, be truthful, which means not lying and not acting helpless when you are not, or not exaggerating and making up any excuses. And it's important here to remind ourselves that DBT, right, holds no singular thing as true. There's no absolutely never lie and absolutely um, lying is good or bad type thing. But here it's don't lie in a way that undermines your sense of self-respect. And we know that typically, though lying might be necessary in certain contexts, like the white lies, that dishonesty as a pattern over time tends to really erode our sense of self-respect, and our ability to like ourselves or feel good about ourselves. And the acting helpless when you are not really comes up as the opposite action to effectiveness, right? If we're acting helpless, that conveys to ourselves that we can't do something, that we're not able to do it ourselves. And instead, the goal here is really effectiveness and feeling that sense of mastery, of competence. Um, and a few extra nuggets to keep in mind when we're thinking about the fast skills. So, first is you are the keeper of your self respect, meaning that while of course people can absolutely do things that are hurtful, that are upsetting, that don't make us feel good in the moment, that ultimately no one can take away your self-respect, and you have a lot of room and ability to determine what self-respect looks like in your life. Next, practicing Dear Man and the Give skill, particularly practicing it effectively, can improve your self respect. So, when we ask for our objectives in a way that feels skillful, and that not only increases the chances that we get what we want, but it also increases the chances that we feel good about ourselves afterwards, whether or not we get what we want, right? And the Give skill here, that maintaining and building relationships, those skills can also tend to increase our self respect because they not only improve the relationship, but they also help us to kind of carry ourselves in a manner that tends to be more consistent with our values, that we want to have an easy manner and validate and show up for the people that we love and care about, and the people who we want to be maintaining and building relationships with. Next, giving up something for another person's well being can improve your self respect sometimes. So, here as well, it's important to be mindful of whether or not our pattern is to always give things up for someone else's well being, or to never do so or rarely do so. Um, because if we're on either end of that spectrum, we can start to erode our self respect over time. And at the same time, we likely all have examples we can think of, perhaps with your kids or your partner or a close friend, where you gave up an objective that you want or something that in the moment was your desire to meet that for another person. Say when someone is sick and you take care of them, when your kiddo has to stay home and you don't go to work or say a party that you want to, but you feel good about yourself and you feel a sense of kind of consistency with your values, that you stayed home and cared for them instead. Um, and next, balancing your desires and the other person's is often the best recipe for self respect. So here's where we get into that middle path when we're thinking about how these different skills fit together. That really holding in mind both what the other person may want or desire, or maybe saying that they want or desire, while also maintaining a clear sense of your own and sticking up for them, tends to bode best. And similarly, using the give skills when indicated, meaning in situations where the relationship is one that you want to be building, and putting them away when not, say in situations where a partner or an individual is being abusive or harmful, also tends to be the best recipe for self respect. So, kind of taken together, being strategic about how we use the skill so we can maximize, make the most out of its potential effectiveness for increasing our ability to build relationships, to get our needs met, and also how we feel about ourselves. Before we meet next week, it would be awesome if you could take a little bit of time to think about, maybe even right now, after watching the video, what barriers tend to get in the way of self respect effectiveness for you. And all of us have at least some factors that can make this process difficult. So that might be beliefs, say that you don't deserve what you want, or that it won't be possible to get what you want, you won't be able to be skillful. It might be a lack of practice, strong emotions like fear or anger that tend to come up in interpersonal contexts, or other environmental factors about specific situations, that like power dynamics, that make it particularly challenging to practice some of the skills we've talked about in today's video. And then on the flip side, kind of when is it easiest for you to practice self-respect? What are the contexts or the situations in which you feel like these skills come easily and are accessible? And what are the contexts and situations in which it feels challenging? All right, that was a lot. I look forward to diving into this more with you guys the next time that we meet and doing some practice and application. Take care, and I'll see you on Tuesday.